Nadia Moore sat by the small window of her cramped apartment, her eyes silently watching the endless flow of traffic below. She loved this city, but it was also a constant reminder of the most painful memory of her life. 12 years ago, when she was just 16, a car accident shattered her world. It was a rainy night, much like this one. Her father had been driving, her mother humming softly to the radio. Then, screeching tires, blinding headlights, a deafening crash. The last thing she remembered was her mother's terrified gasp and the unbearable silence that followed. When she woke up in the hospital, covered in wounds, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the unbearable loss she had to endure. Since then, the fear of driving clung to her like a ghost, turning every moment behind the wheel into a battle against herself. Now, at 28, Nadia was a freelance writer, specializing in romance novels. Despite her talent and passion, success remained elusive. She took on ghostwriting jobs to make ends meet, but her income was unpredictable, barely enough to keep her afloat. Lately, financial troubles had been closing in on her. Overdue rent, unpaid bills, and the growing fear of whether she could continue pursuing her dream weighed heavily on her mind. Yet deep down, she knew that writing wasn't just a job. It was a part of her soul, the only thing that made her feel truly alive. But what Nadia didn't know was that a fateful event was waiting for her, one that would change her life forever. The rain poured down heavily, casting a cold, misty veil over the dark streets. Nadia gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady her breathing as a wave of panic crashed over her. She never wanted to drive, ever. But today she had no choice. Lily had asked her to pick up an urgent manuscript from a cafe, and she hated letting fear dictate her life. As the car entered a deserted road, her heartbeat quickened. Her breaths grew shallow, cold sweat forming on her palms. Then the memories came rushing back. Another rainy night, screeching brakes, blinding headlights. And then it happened again. A pair of headlights flared in front of her. No, she slammed the brakes, but it was too late. A loud, sickening crash echoed through the empty street as her car collided straight into an Aston Martin DBS Superleggera. Nadia's hands trembled as she stumbled out of the vehicle, her stomach twisting at the sight of the massive dent in the luxury car. A tall figure stepped out, his black hair slightly damp from the rain, his tailored suit still impeccable. Albert Johnson, the CEO of the country's most powerful publishing empire. He inspected the damage, then turned his sharp, unreadable gaze to Nadia. $50,000. How do you plan to pay for this? Nadia's mouth fell open. 50,000? She didn't even have 500 to spare. Albert studied her reaction, a flicker of calculation flashing in his gray eyes. His family had been relentless. Marry, settle down, take responsibility. He had spent months dodging blind dates and rejecting their choices. But now, standing before him was an opportunity he hadn't anticipated, a woman who had nothing to gain from him, who needed something just as badly as he needed an escape. If she agreed, it would be perfect. A contract marriage, no emotions, no attachment. His gaze shifted back to Nadia, a stranger, unattached, with no reason to demand affection from him. Or you could marry me for 1 year, the debt will be erased. Nadia froze. His offer was insane, but did she really have another choice? Nadia never imagined marrying a stranger, let alone Albert Johnson. A man who didn't believe in love, who viewed marriage as nothing more than a transaction. The wedding was swift, emotionless. No white dress, no heartfelt vows. Just a signature on a marriage certificate, and it was done. Nadia Moore had become Mrs. Johnson. But from the moment she stepped into his luxurious penthouse, she realized she wasn't a wife. She was just another part of his plan. Albert controlled everything. She had to change her wardrobe to fit the image of a perfect Mrs. Johnson. She had to attend extravagant social events, play the role of a devoted wife beside him in front of business associates. And worst of all, he wouldn't let her write. "You don't need to write anymore," Albert stated bluntly when he caught her opening her laptop. "We have an agreement. Play your part." Nadia clenched her fists, swallowing the anger rising inside her. Writing was her lifeline, her escape. But to Albert, it was nothing more than a waste of time. Their relationship became increasingly strained. Albert wasn't cruel to her, but he never truly treated her as a person either. Then, one night, during their most heated argument yet, Albert let his deepest wound slip. "You think I enjoy controlling everything?" His voice was rough, his stormy gray eyes darker than ever. "Do you even know what it's like to love someone? To believe in a future, only to have it shattered?" Nadia stood frozen. For the first time, she saw raw pain in his eyes. Albert let out a bitter laugh, but his voice was hollow, his hands clenched at his sides. "She carried my child, and I never even knew. By the time she told me, it was already over." His breath shuddered. She looked me in the eye and said it wasn't the right time. Then she left, to be with someone who was ready. He exhaled sharply, his eyes dark with something raw and unspoken. Since that day, I decided I would never let anyone else have the power to hurt me like that again. Silence. Nadia's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't even begin to imagine that kind of pain. But understanding his past didn't mean she would let him control her. And soon, she would prove it to him. Nadia had never felt so alone. She was no longer herself. Each day in the grand penthouse stripped away another piece of her. Albert controlled everything, what she wore, where she went. But the worst part was not the expensive dresses or the fake social events. It was the fact that he had taken away her right to write. But Nadia refused to be silenced. Every night, when the apartment fell into silence, she would pull out her old notebook from under her pillow and write. Those pages were the only place she could be honest. She wrote about the suffocating marriage, about the man who slept just a wall away but felt a world apart, about the emptiness in his gray eyes, about the way he tried to control everything because of his past pain. And then, one night, Albert found it. She was in the bedroom when she heard the sound of pages flipping. A cold shiver ran down her spine. When she stepped into the living room, she saw him standing there, her notebook in one hand, his knuckles white from clenching his fist. His eyes darkened as he read. He is a lonely man, incapable of love. He is so afraid of being hurt that he turns everything around him into a prison, including me. Albert lifted his gaze, his voice dangerously quiet. "So this is what you think of me?" He gripped the journal tightly, his knuckles turning white. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, hesitation. Then, as if convincing himself, his jaw tightened. R.I.P. In a single movement, the pages of her journal were torn apart in his hands. "Albert, stop!" She lunged forward, but it was too late. The shredded pages floated to the ground like scattered snowflakes. Nadia froze, tears pooling in her eyes, not from anger but from pure devastation. That notebook wasn't just paper and ink. It was her soul. She looked at the man in front of her, the man who had controlled her, stripped her of her identity, and now he had destroyed the last piece of her. Her breath hitched, and in that moment, a chilling realization sank in. Albert would never change. Her tears stopped, her heart hardened. Without another word, she turned and walked into the bedroom. 10 minutes later, she emerged with a small backpack slung over her shoulder. Albert looked at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was no longer angry, just cautious. Nadia placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Her voice was steady, but her words cut like a knife. "I don't belong here. I'll pay you back in a month. Don't look for me." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked out. Albert stood frozen, staring at the closed door. There was an emptiness in his chest, as if he had just lost something important, but he didn't understand what it was. Nadia stepped onto the rainy streets, the drizzle mixing with the last of her tears, but this time she wasn't crying out of pain. She was crying for freedom. She had made her choice. Nadia left the city when the sky was still tinged with a muted shade of gray and the streets had yet to wake. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She only knew that she had to leave, had to escape Albert, had to escape everything. She found herself in a quiet countryside town where endless fields stretched beyond the horizon and the wind carried the scent of fresh earth. No one knew her here. There were no lavish parties, no cold, piercing stares from Albert, no suffocating sense of control. But something inside her still missed him. At first, she told herself it was just habit. But at night, when the world outside grew dark and silent, memories of Albert crept back in. The way he sat alone with a glass of whiskey, staring into the void like a man who had lost more than he could ever admit. Time passed quietly, peacefully. One afternoon, Nadia sat beneath a towering oak tree by the lake, her laptop resting on her lap. She took a deep breath, allowing the past to resurface. And then she started to write. Not a novel, not an article, but the story of her and Albert. She wrote about their marriage of convenience, the suffocation, the pain of losing herself. But she also wrote about a lonely man, one who didn't know how to love because he had been broken before. She posted the story anonymously on social media. She expected nothing, just a way to release the emotions she had bottled up for so long. But what she didn't realize was, by the next morning, that story would change everything. The penthouse felt empty in a way it never had before since Nadia left. Albert wasn't used to this silence. He had once thought he liked it. No distractions, no emotions to deal with. But now, the quiet was suffocating, a cruel reminder that she was gone. At first, he told himself she would come back, that she was just being impulsive. But as the days passed, her absence became a hollow ache inside him. He realized he missed her. He missed waking up to see her sitting by the window with a cup of coffee. He missed the way she smiled quietly while reading. He even missed their arguments, because at least then she was still here. Albert wanted to find her, but a part of him was afraid. He had never apologized to anyone before, never admitted he was wrong. Then one evening, while absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone, a story stopped him cold. A tale about a marriage without love, about a man who tried to control everything because he was terrified of losing the things that mattered most. About a woman who once loved him, but couldn't stay. Every word cut deep. And then he saw the photo. A quiet countryside, a wide lake, an old oak tree. Albert stared at the image, his heart pounding. She was there. Without hesitation, he grabbed his car keys. He couldn't lose her, not because of a contract, not because of his pride, but because of a truth so simple yet so painfully clear. He loved her, and this time he would fight to keep her. Albert drove through the night, not stopping, not hesitating. He didn't know what awaited him when he found her, but he knew he couldn't let her go again. By the next afternoon, he arrived in the quiet town. No towering buildings, no extravagant parties, just open skies and endless fields. This was where she had chosen to begin again. He walked along the lake, golden hues of sunset shimmering over the water, and then he saw her. Nadia sat beneath a great oak tree, laptop in her lap, completely lost in her writing. She looked free. She looked like herself again. When she looked up and saw him, her breath caught. Albert stepped forward, his expression no longer commanding, no longer arrogant, just honest. He gently placed a notebook in front of her. I can't give you back your old journal. His voice was rough, but I hope you'll keep writing, and this time, without me stopping you. Nadia looked at him warily. Why are you here, Albert? He exhaled. Because I was wrong. I controlled you. I let my fears dictate my actions. But after you left, I realized something. I never wanted to control you. I just didn't want to lose you. She stayed silent, watching him. I finally understand something too, she admitted. I thought you were just cold, incapable of love. But after I left, I realized you have loved before. You just never knew how. Albert swallowed hard. No one has ever stayed with me before, Nadia. But you made me want to try. For the first time, the distance between them felt like it was fading, but Albert knew words weren't enough. He took a deep breath, then knelt. A simple silver ring rested in his hand, catching the last light of day. No grandeur, no expectations, just sincerity. The first time I proposed, it was to escape my family's expectations. His voice was raw. But this time, I'm doing it because I love you." Nadia's breath hitched. "You don't have to forgive me right now. You can say no and I'll understand, but I'll still be here, waiting, until you want me to stay." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You really are shameless," she murmured. Albert braced himself for rejection, but then she exhaled, eyes searching his face one last time. "Albert, if I say yes, will you let me be myself?" His hands trembled slightly as he held hers. "I swear it." She smiled through her tears. "Then this time, I'll say yes." And as he pulled her into his arms, for the first time there was no fear, no control, only love. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the countryside. Nadia sat on the porch of their small cottage, her laptop resting on her lap, the gentle hum of crickets filling the evening air. She had just finished another chapter of her novel, a love story that, for the first time, wasn't just fiction. It was inspired by her own life. Albert emerged from inside, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to her and sat down beside her, his presence no longer overwhelming, no longer suffocating, just comforting. "How's the story coming along?" he asked, his voice softer than it had ever been. Nadia smiled, tracing her fingers along the keyboard. "It's different this time. It's not about pain or control. It's about healing." Albert was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant fields. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn-out notebook, the one she had given him months ago. "I've been writing too," he admitted, his voice almost hesitant. Nadia's eyes widened in surprise. "You? Writing?" He let out a small chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not a novel like yours, but it's something." She took the notebook from his hands, flipping through the pages. Her heart softened as she read his scribbled words, thoughts, reflections, small confessions of a man who is still learning how to love. Nadia looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Albert, this is beautiful." He met her gaze, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "I told you, I want to try." And as the evening breeze wrapped around him, Nadia realized something. Love wasn't about fixing each other. It was about growing together. And for the first time she knew this love would last.